it's on my bucket list to say this on air.
Right.
Long-time listener, first-time guest.
That's me. You've
Congratulations.
summed me up. Thank you
Excellent.
so much.
I got in before you, Brad.
You did. It's fine. It's all
I've always
good.
wanted to say that.
True
I've also
fan
wanted
of this podcast.
I've also wanted to call the time on radio, like it's 23 past 7. Anyway, let's move on.
Let's move on. Well, welcome back to episode 2, season 2 of the Sunday Monday podcast. Sam, welcome back.
Thanks, mate. It's great to be here. It comes around quickly.
It does, yeah. Every week, in fact.
It's true. It's a bit like Sundays. They just keep on coming.
They do indeed. Hey, we're entering into chapters 3 and 4 of Esther today, and these are kind of the fun chapters of Esther.
I reckon they're the easy chapters. These are the chapters with the quotable quotes, and it's sort of the high point. And I said yesterday, I reckon if Esther was a stage play, at the end of chapter 4 would be when the curtain would drop and the intermission sign would come up. Everyone would go out and get a drink, anticipating what comes next. And to quote you from last week, it gets pretty gory.
It does get a bit gory. It's like an oasis, these chapters between two really other halves of the book.
Yeah, definitely. The tension is well and truly built and established before we find out what happens next.
Yeah, well, let's get into it today with our guest today. Who have we got, Sam?
Yeah, excellent. We have got the star who wrote the series. She asked me not to say that before we hit record, but too bad, Lauren. I'm calling you that because it's,
I'll just accept it.
Good.
I'll take it.
That's a gift and you can accept it. Lauren, it's great to have you on. Fresh back from Africa as at the time of this recording.
Yes.
Tell us, Lauren, as you wrote this series before you left, what was like one big thing from the overview of the whole of the book of Esther? What was one big thing that you
I
took
think
on?
the big thing that really stood out to me is when God is involved, there is a huge difference between coincidence and providence.
Yeah.
And when you take God out of the picture, there's a lot of coincidences that you see in this story. And because God isn't mentioned, you could assume there's just a lot of coincidence. It is made for great is an interesting word, but for a story that gets you in. But when God is in the picture, he is actually providing a way for his people. And provision is seen throughout the whole thing. That was probably my big thing.
That's
it's good. It's really good to have also Christine Wood, a familiar voice maybe to the podcast. Or at least,
really?
Well, at least maybe familiar to our Gateway family, at least anyway.
Yes.
You've been on
Thank you.
staff here a few years ago now. You've had a few adventures since then, but yeah.
Yeah, I have. It's great to be back here and back as part of the team.
Great.
And
Love having you
Christine,
here.
it's on my bucket list to say this on air.
Right.
Long-time listener, first-time guest.
That's me. You've
Congratulations.
summed me up. Thank you
Excellent.
so much.
I got in before you, Brad.
You did. It's fine. It's all
I've always
good.
wanted to say that.
True
I've also
fan
wanted
of
to,
this podcast.
I've also wanted to call the time on radio, like it's 23 past 7. Anyway, let's move on.
Let's move on.
Yeah.
Hey, two of us in the room have actually preached on Sunday.
That's true.
This message from chapters 3 and 4. We got Sam and Christine who've both done that. Christine, you were in the city, weren't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Why don't you give us, and we're going to bring back the timer for this, okay?
Bring back the time. This is a bit scary, this timer.
Got your tight 2 minutes to give us a bit of a summary about your preach. So are you ready to go?
2 minutes and ready to go.
Ready, set, go.
Well, on Sunday, my message was in 3 parts, as all good messages are.
Well done, Christine.
Starting off with chapter 3, where Haman and Xerxes just have this picture of what I would call unrestrained evil in their leadership, where they are just driven by pride and fear and insecurity and revenge, and they just come up with this terrible plot to wipe out an entire nation for what seems to me as really no reason at all other than the fact that they are evil people. Haman comes up with this plan, and then Xerxes just says, yep, that's fine, write it into law, and then let's sit down and have a drink together to celebrate our great plan and our wonderful leadership. And it just makes my skin crawl, and it just makes me feel like God has forsaken his people. This is a place where God is absent, and just reminds me of the world that we live in that appears that God is absent. Then we see Mordecai's plea where he loudly protests against the law that was made to wipe out his people, and gets Esther's attention and sends that royal the message to her that we all know, that says, who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And Esther responds, knowing that her life is in danger, that she will go to the king, and if she dies, she will die, and just has this incredible confidence in the author of her story to go ahead and put her life at risk, knowing that God is in control of the outcome. That is
So
That
close.
is-
1 minute.
1:57.
One eye on the clock,
That's
one eye on the
impressive,
notes.
Christine.
That was fantastic.
that is not good.
Oh, that was great.
That was good. I actually think one of the things that stood out for me as you're sharing that, Christine, is that last verse in chapter 3, where it says, the king and Haman sat down to have a drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. I find that really interesting. Have you learned anything more about that? Because you're kind of talking a bit about how they've just made these plans that are outlandish and evil, but the people were bewildered by their plans too.
Oh, it's amazing. Like, I can't get my head around these guys, to be honest. They just blow my mind, just to have such disregard for human life for no apparent reason.
Yeah, it seems to be willy-nilly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And I just like, why God? Where are you, God? What's going on, God? This doesn't make sense. There is no level that this is okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Xerxes is a bit of a moron, isn't he, really? I mean, he's at a half-year party. He's rather than, and Tim Kay spoke about this in our first week, I think, if I can remember correctly, about how he made a dumb decision about marriage because it wasn't a political marriage like everyone expected, to try and build Persia's power, make a political marriage to get allies. He just had a beauty pageant, and Esther pops up, and she's the most attractive, so she marries him. And now this happens, and then the whole of the city of Susa are reeling from the news.
Yeah.
He
it's,
seems like he's just easily swayed. You
Yes,
just have to kind of
absolutely.
bring something to him. If he sees some
the
interest in
moment.
it, he'll do it.
Yeah, it
Or
seems
he-
like weak leadership or just uncaring leadership.
I think it's probably, let's get this over with so I can get back to the booze.
Yeah.
It's probably what's going
Yeah.
on.
Oh, Sam, you're up next.
Yes, for sure.
You've also preached, so why don't
Yep.
you give us your tight 2 minutes? Ready, set, go.
Excellent. There's this line from Haman that he says to Xerxes when I'm not going to try and pronounce the other name of Xerxes, by the way. I'm just going to keep calling him Xerxes because I can pronounce that one. In the message translation says he describes the Jews as these odd people who don't fit in. And I love that because these guys are in a society not unlike ours, and you said this as well, Christine, that's very tolerant. The Persian Empire is very tolerant. That one of their features as an empire was that all the people that they fought and won against, they would allow them to keep on practicing their religion, and that they were tolerant in that way. That was part of their grace. And we all know in Australia that is very tolerant. That the one thing tolerance can't handle is intolerant religions, and we have an exclusive religion. We make an exclusive claim about God and about Jesus, and that seems intolerant in a tolerant society. You can then be tempted into syncretism, where you blend your religion with the surrounding society, and you don't remain odd, and you do fit in. And it brings me hope that in this context where these people, and Brad, one of your questions from last week is why didn't they return? They stayed in Persia, but they remained odd and they didn't fit in. So they're doing a good thing there. They're doing a good thing. And then into that, so I agree. Xerxes is just apathetic. He doesn't even really know. He shows that he doesn't even know who the Jews are. He doesn't realize that Esther's a Jew. He doesn't show any acknowledgement of these Jewish people. And so when Haman gets in his ear, he's very susceptible to this plan. And then persecution breaks out. So it goes from, or the threat of persecution breaks out, and into this. I spent a lot of time setting up for the moment that Esther has. There's a whole lot more that I said yesterday. But Esther then steps in, and in this moment where she's probably syncretized a bit, she's probably blended in. She hasn't remained odd. She's blended in. But this moment comes to her, and in that moment she steps in humbly, prayerfully, and courageously, and God's people are saved.
Oh, 150.
I scrambled there at the end. That time went really quick, and I'm like, man, I need to speed up here.
Very good.
His actual sermon went for about another 20 minutes after that, so that's fine. No, mate, that's really good. I think this idea of standing out in that place, even though their people seemed odd, is a really key part of this story.
Yeah.
We are odd. Yeah.
We are odd. Do you know the thing that I find fascinating is that there was a time to speak up and stand out, but it had significance because there was actually a time when she was silent too, because she didn't go in to the palace saying, I'm a Jew. Under, I think, Mordecai's recommendation, don't tell them who you are. And she had decided, she had stayed silent and then there is a time to speak up, which
Yeah.
I think is just, I think there's a wrestle for all of us of actually are there times when we do need to stay silent on something because it's not the time to take a stand, but responding to the call of God and trusting his timing that when it's time, it's time.
I find that really interesting, Lauren, because as I read some commentaries and some other books, I was like, I kind of made my mind up that Esther is a courageous, bold woman. And we talked last week about the connections the Jewish people would have made with Daniel and Joseph and others when they're reading Esther's story. But there are a lot of commentators out there, a lot of Bible scholars that want to really get stuck into Esther as someone who gave up all of her morals, to have that place in the palace, all this sort of thing. And she redeemed herself in the end. But then as we get into the following weeks, there's a bit of goriness that comes on the other side of it. But we aren't really told whether Esther went into the palace like as a slave, like under the power of Xerxes. That's what I'm guessing happened.
Yeah.
But nor are we told that she went in with that conscious choice. I'm going to be silent until my time comes. When her resistance to it's a bit of a Moses moment when Mordecai challenges her and says the stuff to her. It's a bit of back and forth through what's the guy's name? Who's the messenger? You can look it up and find it, Brad. You can,
I can't pronounce his name.
Hathach or something. Hathach.
I also think
Hathach.
there's a growth in her, and I see that in my own faith of you actually, the younger you are in your faith, you need people to tell you what to do and how to handle situations
good.
or
Yeah.
have that accountability.
Yeah.
But you actually see her, I think, step into her own throughout this
That's
as
good.
well.
That's good.
I also think that seems to be Esther comes to a point where she's got nothing left to lose.
Yeah.
So, which gives you incredible boldness and power when you no longer fear the consequences. There's nothing left to lose.
Yeah.
So you just go for it with everything.
Particularly
And-
when the stakes are this high.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Literally her life is on the line. There's a chance that she might live if she goes for it. But if she doesn't, she's going to
dead.
die, and everyone she knows
Yeah.
is going to die.
There's also that moment where Mordecai says, "Do you think you alone will be the one Jew who will be
that's
left
right.
alone?"
Yeah.
I think that was really convicting. And it'd be interesting to be Hathach in the middle of this exchange, kind of bringing these messages back between Mordecai and Esther. But I wonder how much of that conviction got to Esther's heart to go, all right, to that point where she's like, if I perish, I perish. I think that's really, really interesting.
Definitely. Well, mate, let's move from tight 2 to something old, something new.
Yeah.
And I reckon, Lauren, it'd be good to hear from you on this as you wrote the series. There is some stuff in Esther that is really well known, some famous lines. But what's something old that you picked up that you were encouraged with,
Yep.
and then something new that you discovered as you
I
wrote
think
the series?
something old is what I have been brought up to know of Esther is that maybe you came to the royal position for such a time as this. And that stands out again. Every time I read it, it still is what I am drawn to, that God positions us in a particular place at a particular time to be a part of joining him in what he is trying to do, the greater purpose he is trying to fulfill in the world. I think in relation to that, probably what stood out to me this time as I've really gone through it is Mordecai's almost bold faith when he says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. I probably had never realized his conviction that deliverance was coming. And the question for Esther is, are you going to be a part of that? Or is it going to be someone else? And that just reminds me of the place that God and his promises are, that he has a plan for his people. And I imagine that was so ingrained in Mordecai as a Jew that he can say that statement with whether it's boldness or not. But I assume he's saying it with boldness.
I reckon that's the clearest reference to God in Esther. Like we've said all through this that God's not named, but that's the clearest reference. Like God's promises, God's purposes will prevail. And I reckon that, like, as much as we might see our country deteriorating or the things around us deteriorating, we can take great hope in the fact that God's purposes, God's plan will prevail no matter what society looks like or where we're heading.
Yeah, and I think it helps you zoom out from the moment of life is all about me in my
Yeah.
time, in my season, to remember that we are part of a grander story that God is outworking throughout history, that we get to be a part of or we get to opt out of.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is really comforting sometimes. And other times you want to be reminded that you've been called for such a time as this.
Yeah.
And God has a purpose and a plan for you.
Absolutely.
We actually need to hold both of those things in tension.
That's good.
Yeah, that's
good.
great. Christine, as you're reading this and doing your own study, what was the thing that jumped out to you, something new?
For me, something new was just looking at the parallels to other for Old Testament and New Testament characters, and then ultimately to Jesus, of others who came into there for such a time of this moment
Yeah.
and had that choice to make. If I perish, I perish. And, or I will be part of this story that God is bringing redemption to the world. So, looking at characters like Daniel, who made the choice courageously to do what was right, even though it meant he was probably going to die. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace made a similar stand. And then people like Paul and the other apostles who made that stand but then lost their lives, most of them, because of standing up for what was right, but still knowing that whatever part they were playing, that they're part of that bigger story of God's redemption. And ultimately, their death was not the end of the story, and that God is still at work. And so that really stuck out to me as I was preparing to preach yesterday.
Yeah, that's great.
That's
That's
excellent.
fantastic.
That's good. Brad, I know you studied history at university.
I did a bit.
Give
yeah.
us a bit of extra Tim K plus from Brad Case on
Well-
the history that surrounds Xerxes and where he finds himself at the time
Sure.
of Esther.
Well, you give me the chance to nerd out here a little
Yeah,
bit.
come on.
'Cause I studied Greek history, ancient Greek history, for about 2 years at university when I first left school. Spoiler alert, I didn't finish that degree and went to Bible college instead. So I don't have a degree in ancient history.
You left the palace
I
and
did.
you went to the go on.
The priory, maybe.
The
Whatever.
priory, that'll do. Yeah,
Just
that's
run with
P2.
P.
Yeah,
Why
that's
are we
good.
illiterate? I don't know
Yeah,
why we do.
I mean-
When he brought up Herodotus too, like I've read the histories from Herodotus thinking this through, and I've always looked at it through the Greek lens. We look at this is about the same time in history where the Greek Empire is just starting to take off. So the Persian Empire is kissing the door of Greece. It's expanded all the way out to India, to the east, and is expanding out to Macedon and the Greek shores. And this is effectively the catalyst that sets Greece up to begin to become a superpower in the world. So you get the whole Sparta versus Athens thing. That's all part of this. You find that the Greeks have their first massive victory against the world superpower Persia at the Battle of Marathon, which Xerxes' dad lost. So Xerxes then takes the throne. Xerxes then goes in and has a victory at the Battle of Thermopylae. That might ring a bell from the movie 300. It's where Sparta held a beach with 300 men.
And all the fighting happened in slow motion, apparently.
That's right,
Yeah.
yep. In that moment, they technically won the Persians, but at a huge cost, like massive cost. It depleted heaps of their men and their manpower and resources. They lick their wounds and they lose the first ever recorded naval battle at the Battle of Sardis, which I find fascinating. Xerxes stuffs up massively and listens to the wrong people and then kind of gets caught out on the eve of winter coming. So he retreats back to Persia, and this is where this story happens.
That's cool.
Like it's that verse 7 where it says, in the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, where we hear that story at the Passover, he's fought a few battles for a few years. He spent a few years going back home, just rebuilding the palaces, rebuilding this road. That's one of the big things he did as part of his plan, was to reinforce the road that his father had made, this royal mile, this royal road. And he gets so full of himself in this place that he just makes it all about him. And I find that really interesting. There could have been any king that this could have come under, but it's Xerxes, who is a defeated king, who is a worldly king, who is a king who's made it all about himself and his own pleasure, that we have the story of salvation where God's people enter into. It's just a great reminder that in those places where it is dark, God worms his way into those stories and begins to make his purposes come out.
That's really good, Brad. It's interesting. Just as I've researched for this week, there's so much out there that says Esther's a fable, like it's a made-up story. it's not historical. It didn't really happen. It's just something to set the Purim festival going and all that sort of thing. But when you get that history, and I could see you were excited about that. Mate.
I'm a history nerd, man.
And that's what this podcast is all about, by the way. Going a bit deeper, that this fits in history. This is historical, and that's excellent.
Well, we also have our special guest, Tim Kay, who has brought some thoughts for us to do. So we're going to listen to that right now, and we'll chat again once we've heard from Tim.
Excellent.
Hey guys, great to be with you. As we look at chapters 3 and 4, there are a number of geeky things that we can look at that help us understand the background and therefore the meaning of these chapters. The first thing is when we meet Haman in chapter 3, verse 1, he's actually said to be an Agagite. And that probably should indicate to us that he was related to Agag, who was the Amalekite king that Saul met in 1 Samuel 15. Part of Saul's downfall was sparing Agag's life. You can go and read that in 1 Samuel 15. Agag represented the great enemy of the people of God as the Amalekite king, this people group that was opposed to Israel. And Esther and Mordecai are actually related to Saul. They're from the same tribe, the tribe of Benjamin, and they have some of the same family names in their family. So that should act as a kind of backdrop to the story where Haman is this representative of the enemies of God's people, and Esther and Mordecai are able to act in a way that Saul failed to act, what Saul failed to do in defeating the enemies of the people of God. Another key thing in chapter 3 is actually the date of the decree of Haman. It says in Esther 3:12 that the decree went out on the 13th day of the first month. Now, you probably don't know what that means, but it has huge significant meaning. The Passover was the 14th day of the first month. And so this decree goes out on the day before the Passover. The Passover was the most significant Jewish festival, and it was commemorating God's rescue of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt when they went out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses. What Esther is effectively doing, the whole book of Esther, is going back over the Passover story. It's remembering the Passover, and in order to do that, they actually need to fast during the festival of the Passover. If you remember, the Passover was actually a feast, but instead of feasting, they're fasting. Later on in chapter 4, Esther says, "Gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day." Effectively, what that means is instead of celebrating Passover, they're going to be fasting at that time. Just imagine on Christmas Eve, someone saying, right, we're declaring a fast for the next 3 days. We're not going to eat or drink anything for 3 days. Effectively, what that's saying is we're canceling this holiday. And the meaning of that is really significant. That's because if God doesn't rescue us again, like he rescued us at the Passover, then the Passover has no point. The Passover was God rescuing the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. But if Haman succeeds in his decree to destroy the Israelites, then the Passover has no point. Another super interesting thing that's a backdrop to this story, a historical backdrop, is the Persian postal service. You didn't expect to be hearing about that. There was this royal road that Xerxes' father Darius created that went 2,700 kilometers from Susa, which is in modern-day Iran, to Sardis in western Turkey. And if you were to walk the royal road, it would take you 90 days. But these couriers had fresh horses available at every different post along the way. And so they could do the royal road in 9 days. Herodotus, who was this early historian, one of the first, really the fathers of history, he wrote about the royal road. He said, "There's nothing in the world that travels faster than these Persian couriers. Neither snow nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." And we see these couriers playing a key role in the story of Esther almost a number of times in the story. These couriers are going out across the empire with decrees. Of course, this decree is the decree of the destruction of the Jews that for many parts of the empire will be arriving on the day of Passover. There were, in chapter 4, a number of key things about the faith of Mordecai and Esther as well. And of course, that's going to be a key part of the takeaway for each one of us. One thing I love about Mordecai's faith, you really see it in chapter 4 when he says, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place." It's clear that Mordecai believes in the promises of God. He can say with certainty that relief and deliverance will come. The only reason he could possibly say that is that he believes in God's promises. But what I love is that he says to Esther, "And who knows, maybe you came to your royal position for such a time as this." He doesn't actually say it as a declaration. He doesn't say, "You are definitely queen right now for this reason." He says, "Who knows? This might be God's calling on your life." And I love that Mordecai is suggestive about that rather than declarative, because it actually echoes much of what we experience in our own lives. We don't really know what God is doing, but we can see his hand at work, and we can believe his promises and base our lives on the certainty of his promises. Esther then, of course, agrees with Mordecai and goes into the king. And that is the only time in the whole book of Esther where a character changes. Esther was not going to go into the king, and now she decides, okay, I will go into the king. And when a character changes their approach at a pivotal point in the story, that actually shows that that character is the main character in the story. So Mordecai is always this wise figure. The king is always this foolish, rich and wealthy figure. Haman is always this evil figure. But Esther is the main character of the story, and you can see that because she changes what she's doing. So there's a kind of character arc, which is a key literary device in storytelling. Thanks, guys. Looking forward to next week.
We haven't come up with a good enough name yet, Brad, for Tim's section.
We haven't.
It was geeking out on the Greek when we were looking at a book that was written in Greek. It doesn't quite work for a book written in Hebrew, but
No. I reckon we just call it The Genius of Tim Kay.
That'll do.
That'll do.
Let's just do that.
How good was that?
Phenomenal. What a brilliant addition to the Sunday Monday podcast. Christine, what's your reaction to what Tim had to share?
I just loved how he talked about the relation to Passover and the festival of Passover and the timing of that call that Esther made to fast and the significance of that for the people, where they've prepared their food, they've got their lamb, they've got the expense of Christmas, so to speak, their equivalent, and yet they cancel all of that, and it has a huge impact on them.
It's probably one of the things that makes them a bit odd in the Persian Empire,
true.
right? Like the fact they practice these things, including Passover, and I liked his correlation between like Christmas and Passover. Imagine if we cancel Christmas in this way, how big a shock that would be for us.
All those people who put their tree up recently.
Yeah. Or started their Christmas shopping,
Don't get me started on people putting their trees up early, Lauren. We stay focused on this podcast.
But the fact that they're fasting instead of feasting means they're giving up all of that, because if he doesn't come through, what's the point? I really like that point that he made. Yeah,
it speaks to me as well. Like, I'm still so fascinated. Maybe it's a question for Tim in our bonus episode at the end of this. What's the context in which Esther is written? Because it seems so subversive. It's got all these little hints in it that a Jewish audience reading Esther would have known straight away. Like, as soon as that date is referenced, it'd be like us going to a country that doesn't even acknowledge Christmas, doesn't know anything about it, and there's a secret book getting around that says, and on the 25th of December, that's when the decree was made. And so suddenly we're all changing our Christmas plans.
Yeah.
There's little hints without being really, it's all implicit and not explicit.
Yeah.
And there's just little hints along the way that people would have known straight away, including the Benjaminite reference to being related to Saul, and Agag being a Amalekite and all that sort of thing.
And it's that, I wonder whether that comes into play of even the fact, I know people question whether Esther should be included in the scriptures because it doesn't mention God, but I wonder whether that's from our lens. That critique comes, whereas it was so obvious to those that this is a part of it, because we see all these things that keep pointing to. And
I just come back to a point from last week, Brad, that we live in a time and in a culture that is saying keep God's name out of it. We don't want, do your thing, do your thing on Sunday, and have your fun, but keep God's name out of the marketplace. Keep it out of the marketplace of ideas. Keep it out of the center. We don't want to hear your references to God. So it's like Esther is so relevant to now. Like, if you're a chaplain in a school, You can do everything. Just don't talk about God.
Yeah.
Don't mention him.
I reckon the thing that stood out to me in all this was that it's the continued pattern of God's people kind of getting it right, but not quite. So if we're looking at Saul and their failure to get rid of the Amalekites there, and King Agag's part of that, we get to this. That continues out through all of the Old Testament, through the prophets, through the kings, or you name a scenario. God's people kind of got their 90% through forgiveness and grace with God, and then just didn't quite keep it going. It's this pattern of failure.
Yeah.
And then Esther enters the story, and they're in that same pattern again. And I don't want to spoil what's happening in the next few weeks, but there's a victory for Esther here, but it's hollow. It's not quite right. There's a whole bunch of murder at the end of the story. Again, points to this story. Without Christ at the center of the story, we are doomed to continue to fall short of God's best plan for our life.
Yeah.
It's that we ultimately needed Jesus in the end. And whether there are some theologians who point to that line from Mordecai, if deliverance will come from another place, is this a messianic prophecy forward, or are they just talking about what's happening in this story? I like to think with the lens of Jesus looking back through history, we can see again through every Old Testament story that there's pointing to Jesus.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. What do we say after that? That sounds like a wrap-up, Brad.
Oh, sure.
Well, we're so glad you've tuned in to listen to episode 2 of season 2. We want to remind you, we're going to look towards the end of this series doing a question and response episode, a bonus episode with Tim Kay. A book like Esther, like any other book of the Bible, it is going to raise questions that people have. You can email those questions to us. The email address to send them to is sundaymonday@gatewaybaptist.com.au. If you didn't hear that, go to our show notes, go to our description or whatever it is, and find the email address and email your questions so that we can have a further chat with Tim Kay. If you've been listening, you know he's got a lot of insight into this great book. And you can send your questions in. We'll put them to him and have a deeper conversation on the other side of our regular season.
Looking forward to that. But that's enough from us today.
Yeah.
Christine, Laurie, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
We'll catch you next week.
Brilliant.